And welcome to Around the Ozarks Spotlight. Each week we uncover the stories behind the people who live and work here in Southwest Missouri. Those individuals with entrepreneurial spirit who work to better the lives of others or put pen to paper to write books about the stories and history of the Ozarks and its people. I'm your host, Scott Meier. Today we're going to explore the world of local politics. I have with me the Springfield Mayor, Ken McClure. Ken, how are you?
I'm well, sir. Good morning. Good to see you.
Excellent. We've not officially met before, but I guess better late than never. I have been part of the Springfield community now for about 8 years, and I think in that time you've been the mayor.
Well, I've been mayor for 6 years, plus 2 years prior to that when I was on city council. So, 8 year. I'm beginning my ninth year in public service, either as mayor or a city council member.
So, having not known you 6 to 8 years ago, was the gray hair there at that time, or has that come since you've been the mayor?
Well, a little bit of both. A
I can believe that. I can believe
little
that.
bit of both.
Let's give our listeners a chance to get to know you a little bit. Who was Ken McClure? Where were you? Where were you born?
Well, I was born in Springfield. I
Okay.
am a fifth generation Springfieldian. My family goes back here to prior to the Civil War.
Wow.
I'm generation five, generations six and seven also live here. So long time Springfieldian, long time Springfield roots. All through the public schools here. My undergraduate degree was from what was then SMS, and then I
Sure.
left for graduate school for the Army. Most of my career was spent though in Jefferson City, 25 years living there. So that's where my wife and I raised our family, our two daughters. And when they talk about home, they talk about Jefferson City,
Really?
where all of their schooling took place. But
Sure.
then came back here, worked for city utilities for several years, went back to Jefferson City with Governor Blunt, and came back to Missouri State and retired from there. So long time Springfield roots, although Jefferson City is a very favorite place of ours as well.
So where'd you go to high school?
I went to Parkview High School, graduated
Okay.
in 1968, and Parkview had three things of distinction then. One was our basketball team. We were the Jolly Green Giants, won the state title in 1964, 3 years
Okay.
in a row as a finalist in there. Excellent band. I played trombone, still play trombone.
Hmm.
But at that time, our band was named as the official representative of the state of Missouri at the New York World's Fair in 1965.
Is that right?
That was a big, big deal.
Well, they used to be a big deal, the World's
We
Fairs.
traveled to New York. We marched to
Hmm.
the World's Fairgrounds. We did a concert in Washington, D.C. Just excellent time. And then 2 years later, our orchestra did the same thing with Expo 67, the World's Fair that was in Montreal. So
Sure.
Parkview was and still is a very special place. My mother taught there for 27 years. So my brother, sister, and I all graduated there. Strong ties to that school.
So the roots go deep.
They go very, very deep. And
Yeah.
really, interestingly enough, my great grandfather fought in the Battle of Wilson's Creek in
Hmm.
1861, and we are in Springfield in Greene County because of that battle.
Do I dare ask which side?
Well, he fought for the Missouri State Guard, which
Okay.
was affiliated, eventually joined the Confederate Army, but he was captured right before, prior to the Battle of Vicksburg, before Vicksburg fell, and was in a prison camp for the rest of the war. But his brother fought for the Union, and his
Sure.
father-in-law, my great-great-grandfather, also fought for the Union. So we
Yeah.
really were split.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it. Not only you had the two sides, the north and south, but then you had all the highwaymen back in the day, right? The ball knobbers, and you had the
Ball
folks,
knobbers, Jayhawkers, all of
Jayhawkers. I mean,
being this close to the Kansas border and all of the controversy that went with Kansas coming into the Union, and is a free state, slave state. How does Missouri fit in?
sure.
And, interestingly enough, Scott, Missouri had the third largest number of battles in the Civil War of any other state. Virginia and Tennessee were the only ones with more battles, and really that was
Mhm.
because of the rivers. Missouri was a border state, never left the Union, but was very heavily contested as both sides
Mhm.
wanted it, primarily because of the transportation.
I hope locals. It's funny. moving there and only living there for a short time as we have so far, we played tourist, obviously, the first couple of years we were there, and we went to see a lot of things that many of my local friends have said, well, we never went there. We've never been there. And, we've lived here our whole lives. But to get to know the history, and certainly the history of that period, not to get political in this show because it's not a political show, but they talk about the two sides today never being further apart. I beg to differ. If you go back to the late 1850s and the early 1860s, things were pretty split, and it was pretty cut and dried.
They were very split, and Missouri was considered a border state. Never left the
Sure.
Union. The governor at the time, 1861, Claiborne Fox Jackson, tried his best to take the state into the Confederacy.
Really?
And ended up failing with that. One of his allies was a former governor, Sterling Price, who then became a general in the Confederate Army and commanded the Missouri State Guard out of Wilson's Creek. But Missouri ended up with two governments. One was the official one, and then the Confederate government in exile, which actually went down to Texas. So you had two governors, one for the North, one for the South, and it was very, very divided, to your point, very contentious.
You're hearing my guest today and Around the Ozarks Spotlight, the Honorable Mayor Ken McClure here in Springfield, and former city council person as well. Before we get too far into your political stature and what you're doing, how different is it being the mayor from being someone sitting on council?
It is much different. The mayor presides over the meetings, has a vote. Some mayors preside over meetings, do not have a vote, but they do have a veto. I do not have a veto, but I do have a vote. It's much different. And each mayor, if you look back over certainly recent history, has done things differently, and that's to be expected. The mayor that follows me will do things differently from me, I'm sure. But it's pretty much a full-time job. I spend 40 plus hours a week doing this, and that doesn't mean you sit in an office all day long.
Sure.
I usually start early in the morning. There's a lot of reading to do, and I try to get that done, particularly as you get closer to council meetings on Monday evening, where you have a lot of bills and the background information on there. But I do a lot of things that are good. For example, just a few days ago, I was at the 100th anniversary of the zoo, doing a proclamation there. I did some other traveling last week on official business. I love to do proclamations. I love to do ribbon cuttings. A new business comes in, or a new entity of some sort, and that gives them the recognition that they need. So that's the exciting part about it. But I'm the official head of the city, and so some of what I do goes to that. And that was really evident during the pandemic, starting in March of 2020. So my whole world changed at that point in terms of being mayor and the pressures that went with that.
Well, as it did all of us. I mean, I was myself managing a company with 60 people, and we went through some real interesting times. Now, you graduated high school in 1968. What was your draft number?
Well, the draft was at that point there was no draft number. The draft was for everyone. And so I started college in the fall of '68. Vietnam was very, very much in the news. And
sure it was.
Essentially, if you went to college, you got a student deferment. But if you got out or flunked out or whatever, then you were eligible for the draft. And I remember I was scared to death my first day in college. I went to English class, and he made us write a paper on the first day, and I thought, I'm going to flunk out before I get out of my first day. But ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, Army ROTC, was mandatory at what was then SMS for all males first 2 years. And then you could go on if you opted to for the last 2 years and get a commission.
It was mandatory. Let's back up for a second. It was mandatory.
It was mandatory, but you have to remember the draft was mandatory too. There were no, at that point, this was pre-lottery. And so everyone was going to serve unless you had a legitimate deferment. So yes, it was mandatory, and you had to wear a uniform once a day. And I remember trying to map my route out about around campus so I wouldn't see an officer and have to salute.
Sure.
But to your point on the lottery, the lottery came in during my sophomore year, and I got a low number, and so that meant if I finished college, so I ended up taking the advanced ROTC course, which meant that I did get a commission, when I
Sure.
graduated. And so that was the right move. I thought if I'm going to serve, then I would rather be an officer than going
Yeah.
in to the enlisted ranks.
You know, it's funny. I graduated high school in '72, so I was in the lottery, the last year of the lottery, and I tried to join ROTC Navy ROTC at Marquette in Wisconsin, and of course that was packed. You couldn't get in there. You couldn't get in there unless you knew somebody who knew somebody
Yeah.
who knew somebody. I did not have to serve, but I want to thank you for your service. So you went into the Army, and where did they ship you
Well,
off?
they
Where-
sent me to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana.
Okay.
Indianapolis, and so I became very familiar with Indianapolis. Loved it. It's the smallest fort in the nation. I was in the Adjutant General Corps, and the Finance Corps was also there. They trained a lot of foreign officers, so we saw a lot of foreign uniforms around there. And the guideline to us at that time is I was a second lieutenant going in that, and they said most of the foreign officers outrank a second lieutenant, so salute any foreign uniform you see. So
Sure.
we did that. But you know, Scott, the interesting thing, the Army was the best leadership training I ever had.
Mm-hmm.
I was so grateful for that, and even the skills that you learn and apply to this day, many of them go back to the Army. And the Army taught me I can do things that I didn't think I could do, both physically and mentally. And so
Sure, I bet it did.
I was very grateful for the experience that I had from that.
Did you have to serve here stateside, or did they
No,
ship you off?
I was in states. The interesting thing, this was this time where once we got out of Vietnam, because when I started college, Vietnam was front and center.
Oh, absolutely.
By the time I got out, it was winding down.
Mm-hmm.
We were out of there just a short time after that. And during the period of time that I served, we were not anywhere. This unique period of time. And of course, at that point, they were just shifting to the volunteer Army. But if you look at what reservists are required to do today, constant opportunities, risk, whatever you want to call it, to be called up, that wasn't the case back then. We weren't anywhere. And so I'm grateful for the time I had in the Army. But when I look at people that have served, even going back World War II, Korea and Vietnam, and some of the Iraq, Afghanistan, and while I served, and I'm proud of my service, but I didn't do nearly what those folks had to do.
No, but don't downplay the fact that you were always on call. You know,
Yeah.
that's the one thing that people sometimes forget, that when you're in the service can determine and dictate where you're going to go and what you're going to do.
Yeah, it sure can. So, and I was, I was prepared the whole time to do what I needed to do and would have done. So again, grateful for the experience, grateful for the training that I had. You can't replicate that, in my opinion. And it's
now, other than ROTC, what was your favorite courses in college?
Oh, I was a history major.
Okay.
Focused on initially the 21st century, 20th century. But when got to graduate school, then my focus was on Civil War, pre-Civil War, and so I have 2 degrees in history, and those were my favorite areas.
And it's true what they say, that history does repeat itself.
History does repeat itself, and you see that so many times.
Yeah, and we're probably living in those times
I
now.
think you are exactly right.
Before we go to break, let's catch folks up on Mrs. McClure. You said you met, she's originally from Springfield as well?
No, my wife was from Minneapolis. I'm a widower. My wife passed away 12 years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
And so we were married 36 years, and she had some pretty serious health problems the last few years of her life. So we were married 36 years. She was a native of Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And we met singing in a gospel quartet and did that for a number of years. And so I have 2 daughters, both born in Jefferson City.
Yeah. And, well, the weather's better where we are now. I think you would agree.
We would only go to Minneapolis in the summer or the fall.
Well, my wife is from Rochester, Minnesota, so
Hey, well,
trust me, I
know.
understand. Yeah, we lived in Minneapolis for seven very cold years, and that's a whole nother show in itself.
Yeah.
You're hearing my guest today, Springfield Mayor Ken McClure, on Around the Ozark Spotlight. We're going to have to break here in just a moment. When we come back, we're going to find out about what he does every day. He's going to tell you in his own words, and I think you're going to be surprised at just how involved he is in a lot of things that affect your life. You're listening to Around the Ozarks Spotlight, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Hey, everybody, it's Ethan and Sarah Forhetz from your favorite podcast, Around the Ozarks in 5. I'm sure you've been wondering, how can I get even more amazing stories, events, and witty banter to start my day?
Well, look no further. Here we are. Sign up for our daily newsletter. You'll have what's going on around the Ozarks right at your fingertips each weekday morning.
Yeah, just go to aroundtheozarks.com, click on the newsletter tab to sign up.
Thanks for listening to Around the Ozarks in 5. We hope to see you in your inbox soon.
Welcome back to the second half of today's Around the Ozarks Spotlight. I'm your host, Scott Meier. With me, the very honorable Mayor Ken McClure from Springfield, Missouri, right here in southwest Missouri. Now, you spent a lot of time in Jeff City. Obviously, with a history background, politics has been important to you. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Yeah. So your time in Jeff City, you went there to be Roy Blunt's number two. That's who you followed there, isn't it?
Well, I was Matt Blunt, his son, Governor Blunt.
Oh, okay.
But my time goes back much earlier than that. My first professional job was as a budget analyst for the Senate Appropriations Committee. And that was the very first professional staff that the Missouri Senate had hired. Our staff was 4 people, a 72-year-old man who had been brought out of retirement. He was Governor Dalton's budget director back in the 1960s. And then 3 folks about my age, and his challenge was teach these young men about state government, how to be budget analysts, how to write legislation. And then I headed that staff for 5 years, so I worked for 4 different senators who chaired the Appropriations Committee.
I see.
And then I was the deputy director of the Missouri Department of Economic Development, did all the administrative work. But that training taught me the economic development tools. It's really I still use that. I understand the incentives that are offered, the laws. And then Governor Ashcroft appointed me to the Missouri Public Service Commission, which is a 5-member quasi-judicial body that regulates the state's investor-owned electricity, natural gas, water, sewer, and at the time, landline telecommunications.
Okay.
You serve terms on that. So I served a full 6-year term plus 1.5 years of an expired term. When that ended, then I thought we were going to the East Coast. The laws for public service commissions are pretty strict. You can't really look for work unless you're out of work.
Oh, is that right?
That's
Okay.
to prevent the conflict of interest.
Sure.
And so I left office on May 5 of 1997, and the phone rang at 10 after 12, and I had a job offer in Washington that would have put me there. But we came to City Utilities. They reached out and basically said, "Do you want to come home?" And my wife and I talked about retiring in Springfield, and so that made a lot of sense. So I came home, was an associate general manager for 8 years at City Utilities, and then went to Governor Blunt from there. Governor Blunt, Senator Blunt's son,
Sure.
lived in Jefferson City when then Secretary of State Roy Blunt was in office, and I was Matt Blunt's Sunday school teacher at our church. And so
Is that right?
he's exactly 20 years younger than me.
Yeah.
But that established a relationship. And so he ran for Secretary of State in 2000. I did some policy work for him and did his transitional work, and then did the same thing when he ran for governor in 2004 and headed his transition, which is a very intense 10-week period between the election and inauguration day, where essentially you put an administration together. And then served as his chief of staff. And when I left there, I came to Missouri State as vice president and was there for 8 years and retired from there. So I've been around a lot of different folks who have been in elective office. Never, ever
Sure.
thought I would run for office.
Did you find? Tell me a little bit about your time in Jeff City when you were around the legislators. Did you find that a great time in your life, or did you find it humbling or interesting or not interesting? I mean, I think sometimes people see the legislature in a lot of different ways. I know I do personally, and there's some people there that are the good guys, and there's some people there that aren't such good guys, and I think it gets frustrating to some of us that are at this point in time simply taxpayers. We just wonder what happens there sometimes. And you were there, and you're behind the scenes. I mean, you're not on the floor of the state house necessarily, but you really saw what was happening Is it as good as we think or want to think it is, or are there some things that really could use some help?
Well, there are a lot of things that can use some help that were different from when I was in office. No political reflection at all one way or the other, but the Democrats were in control when I worked for the Senate, and really all of my time in Jefferson City up until the time I went to work for Governor Blunt. So there were Democrats in the majority in both the House and Senate, and that goes back to World War II, and some of the numbers were just the reverse of what they are right now in terms of the ratio between Democrats and Republicans. But you had a real difference, and that is there were no term limits. Right now, there are term limits. They were put in place in 1992, so the clock started ticking in 1994. But essentially, you can serve 2 4-year terms in the Senate, or you can serve 4 2-year terms in the House for a total of 8 years. If you max that out, you could serve a total of 16. But there were some legislators that had served years and years and years. And they developed an expertise. Some were experts in agriculture, some in business, some in law enforcement. And you had a much different environment because people weren't always looking to what the next move would be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a major change. Right now, when people go into the legislature, almost immediately, then you start mapping out, when am I going to try to move to leadership, or am I? Am I going to try to move from the House to the Senate? How am I going to face potential primary opponents that might run against me?
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have that nearly to the extent, and I think it made for a much better environment. I worked for the Senate at the time, and you really could not tell the difference between a Republican and a Democrat. Some of the most powerful senators at the time I worked for them were 3 Republicans, one from Springfield, one from Joplin, another one from Cassville.
Mm-hmm.
But they got along very, very well. You miss that camaraderie. I don't see that right now. I love the Missouri Senate. I spent the early years of my employment there, but it's much different now. The division is serious, in my opinion. I don't like that. I don't care which party's in charge. It wasn't that way for years and years, and I attribute it all to term limits. And initially, I could say I could argue either way because somebody said, "Well, I'm sure glad they're leaving. They've not been good." On the other hand, I sure hate to see somebody good leave. But I think we're not well served by term limits being in place.
Well, it appears again in history past that the pendulum swings both ways, and at some point, hopefully, it'll swing back to where it makes more sense. Now, as mayor, you've spent 6 years as mayor. Have you accomplished the things that you wanted to accomplish in those 6 years? And what kinds of things are you looking forward to as we move on further along in your second term? And are you term limited? Is the mayor term limited?
Yes. To answer that question first, the mayor is term limited. I serve a 2-year term, and the mayor is limited to 4 2-year terms. I'm in my last term, my 4th term. So that will end in April of 2025, and at that point, I cannot run again. Council members serve a 4-year term, and they are not term limited. They can serve as long as they wish and can be elected. So that's a major difference between the mayor and a council member. We've accomplished a lot. One of the challenges when I came into office back in 2017 was public safety. It still is, but we're dealing, for example, with significant funding issues. Our fire chief at the time had said we have got to have 2 new fire stations, and if we can't fund those, then we're going to have to close 2 of them down. Well, nobody wanted to do that, but we didn't have the money to do that, either to build it nor to staff it. But we came up with a creative solution called the level property tax. And that's a tax that's been in place since 1996, and it was originally put in place to bond capital improvements, sewer, stormwater, that type of thing. But over time, we had paid down much of that debt, and so we had some headroom in there. And so we went to the voters and said, no tax increase, but allow us to use that headroom money for public safety, for other capital types of items, and it passed 76%. And so we've been able to do that. Allowed us to build 2 new fire stations. It allowed us to devote resources to certain select staffing of the police department. Very, very successful type of thing. We focused a lot on infrastructure. We have a 1/4 cent capital tax. We have 8-cent transportation tax, all used for infrastructure. So proud of that. We got into with the pandemic. That was something no one saw coming, of course. I can remember just about every day of March 2020. And what I like to say, Scott, is we have a weak mayor here, really do. Up until our charter was adopted.
A weak mayor system.
Weak mayor system.
A weak mayor system, not a weak mayor, but a weak mayor system.
We have a weak mayor system. The charter was adopted in 1953, and at that point, the elected mayor was abolished. So city council chose the mayor from among its ranks, and if you serve long enough, you get a chance to serve time as mayor. It came back in the 1980s, but was really given limited authority, and people also said you only get a 2-year term as opposed to a council member who gets 4.
Sure.
So what I tell people is I preside over meetings. I can set the agenda to an extent. I have a vote. I issue proclamations, which I love to do, and I sign cemetery deeds. And beyond that, it's the power of the bully pulpit. Except in an emergency situation, such as we had in the pandemic. And then per city code, once the council declares the emergency, all of that responsibility falls on the mayor. You go from being in a weak mayor system to a very powerful one. So that was a real eye-opener back in 2020. We, I think, handled the George Floyd situation very well. But our police department, like others, was suffering from low staffing. We've always been understaffed, but we really experienced it then. We've been able to turn that around. We are not anywhere close to where we need to be. We still got about 50 vacancies, and my goal is to hopefully get fully staffed by the time I leave office in a year and a half or so. We want to focus on our comprehensive plan. That we've adopted that. That will guide us for the next 20 years. We're starting now to deal with some of the zoning changes that are being required. We've done very well with some things that were challenges. Keeping the Springfield Cardinals here, we were able to.
Congratulations on that, by the way.
That was
smart.
Well, we have been negotiating on that for over 5 years, and I tell people I know more about bankruptcy law than I ever thought I would.
Ever wanted to, probably.
Well, that needed to happen following Mr. Hammond's passing in 2014 and going into bankruptcy and the disposition of his assets. But Major League Baseball now controls the minor leagues, and they pretty well dictate what was going to happen. So we ran a very real risk of losing the Cardinals. But St. Louis Cardinals were just excellent partners. We worked so well together. So we have a lease with them for 15 years. So we have a professional development license with the Major League Baseball for 10 years, which is the maximum that they offer.
Sure.
So we've got them, and it's enabled us to make necessary improvements that Major League Baseball is required for that ballpark. We've got a Buc-ee's that will open up the 1st of December, and that's the first one in Missouri. So that's exciting. Lake Springfield is undergoing a massive change after the decommissioning of the power plant out there. I want to finish those types of things. We've got a housing study going on. We want to be able to increase the levels of home ownership for those desiring to do that. So I'm hopeful that by the time my term's up that we'll have made good progress. You never, ever end a public policy, but you want to leave things as strong as you can.
Toughest question I'm going to ask you today. Do you think Springfieldians fully understand how good they have it in the city of Springfield compared to other cities that size?
The answer, short answer is no. And it's not just city of Springfield. You say that about city utilities. People complain about the utility until they go somewhere else and see what type of thing. The best thing I hear is from people say, well, we've been away for a while. We've come back. Or people that come in and will say, we had no idea this type of good existence was there. So I think the short answer to your question is, and I'm generalizing, of course, but I think probably not.
I had moved to Springfield. I think it was the first month I was here back in 2016. And there was a family of 4 that came into a restaurant. I was having breakfast, and they sat and held hands and said a prayer. I came down from Detroit, Michigan, and I must tell you, in Michigan, you probably wouldn't see that. I don't recall seeing it. We lived there for 23 years. And, it's a small thing, but it's a big thing. And I think the fact that Springfield, I think, is about families. And I think Springfield's about a lot of things having to do with a great merging of Southern and Northern personalities and families and traits. And I think it's a pretty special place. And I feel blessed to be in Springfield and getting to know people and getting to know someone like you, Mayor. I think you've done a hell of a job, and looking forward to your next 2 years. We're about out of time. You want to say goodbye to the folks, and we'll wrap it up.
It's been my pleasure, Scott. Thank you for the visit. Always enjoyable, and I appreciate the opportunity.
I want to thank my guest, Mayor Ken McClure, as well as all of you today for being around our broadcast. My producers, Taylor Worley and Jay Stevens, as well as everyone out in the broadcast world for joining us. If you happen to miss all or part of today's program, you can always find it in its entirety on the MidwestFamilySpringfield.com website, the AroundTheOzarks.com site, or our new app for ATO, which can be found in Apple apps or Android apps, where you can also hear and view not only today's show, as well as all the earlier shows this year and last year. I'm your host, Scott Meier. Remember, every day is a gift. Have a great day.